Welcome to another episode of the CarryTrainer Higher Line podcast. Welcome to another episode of the CarryTrainer Higher Line podcast. I always have to do my annoying radio voice whenever I do that for some reason. Once you hit record, you can't talk normal. We've got the famous William Aprill of Aprill Risk Consulting. 2 L's, right? Not one.
That's right.
You're down in New Orleans?
I am. And it's
or thereabouts?
We're getting the full New Orleans effect today. You just missed a rain squall coming through. We got 3 inches of rain in about 45 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So when it rains here, it is no joke.
You've been down there a long time, you told me. You just don't sound like you're from down there.
Yeah, I'm a native. I'm from here, but I never did pick up an accent. But New Orleans accent in the first place is not what you'd think of it. It's not sort of a stereotypical Southern accent. New Orleans is a port city. For a long time, busiest port in the country. And so, if you listen to somebody who's deep from New Orleans, they sound more like they're from Brooklyn than they're from Georgia.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I lived in the Northeast for a good long time too. Went to college in Massachusetts and then lived in upstate New York. So about 10 years, after young adulthood, I was up in the Northeast.
How was the time during Katrina for you?
As it goes, I didn't have it that bad. My house is relatively high. Relatively high in New Orleans is 4 feet above sea level. This is an older part of town. My house is from 1871, and they only built where it didn't flood.
They knew better.
So I was okay, but my business was destroyed and all that good stuff, and family kind of scattered all over the states. But a lot of people had it much, much, much worse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, people that don't know who William Aprill is, you're part of the ShivWorks collective, right?
Yeah, it's a wretched hive of scum and villainy. Right?
That's not true. So far, everybody I know from that crew is good dudes. So your dovetail into that is the true mindset of evil, right? That's kind of your specialty with your. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it got started out. We were just friends, but sort of had a lot in common philosophically and practically, and just found ourselves agreeing about a whole lot of stuff. And it's sort of evolved into a loose, evolving doctrine. And sort of my side of the house is the mindset side of the house, and then applied pistol too. But a great deal on the mindset side of the house because of my work in mental health, but also I worked in law enforcement early in my life, and they just kind of came together in sort of a weird way. It's, I think there's a lot of translation back and forth. Mental health, the mental health industry has some important things to say to the self-protection industry, but also vice versa. And so being in that weird little transitional node to kind of help translate back and forth has really been helpful. It helped me understand, and it turns out there's a market for people who want to understand better. Just yesterday. No, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you please.
Well, just yesterday I was talking to somebody, and what he was sort of shaking his head about. This happens to me all the time. Somebody will send me a news clip of some terrible thing that happened near them, and they're just they're sort of throwing up their hands about it. And there's a real tendency to say that if it's it's inexplicable. There's just no planning for this. There's no preparing for this. And that's a really dangerous mindset because that makes it seem like predatory violence especially is, out of the blue, like getting hit by a piece of a falling satellite or something. And that's not the case at all.
For sure.
There is an internal logic to this. There's a way of looking at it that makes sense, but that way doesn't fit very well in a normal person's head. What I often say is, we've got to make parking spots in our head for the way the bad guys think. Because if you can't kind of reverse engineer the way the bad guys think, you can't ever change the things you do that make you vulnerable to them.
Right.
Think of it this way. In a perfect world, we'd never have to lock our houses and cars, right? But we know that it's not a perfect world, so we do. We do lock our car when we leave. We lock our house when we leave because there are people who might try to get in without our permission. So in a sense, that's the kind of most basic kind of red teaming, unquote, of really thinking about where am I vulnerable? And you can do a whole lot more about that. I talk all the time about developing what I call a personal risk profile or an individual risk profile. And it's taking a really cold-blooded look at your lifestyle and saying, if I were going to kill me, if I were going to rob me, if I were going to exploit me, when and where and how would I do it? And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but I'd like to think it shouldn't.
It's interesting. We talk in our classes. I just had a class in Tennessee last week, and one of the questions I was asking the students, we were pushing them physically, and some of these guys were law enforcement, and I said, I'm trying to kill you. When are you going to quit? And I wasn't talking so much about like fighting spirit. I was just kind of get them in the mode of like, this is not just shooting at paper. And we're chatting about this. And one of the guys raised his hand and said, you'll never know till you're in that moment. I said, well, isn't that kind of scary? Like, what are you going to do if your car flips over with your family in it? Are you just going to wait until that ever happens to think about or plan for that? Or if there's a house fire? Last night, my alarm went off at my house due to a short in our alarm system, which scares the shit out of you at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're sound asleep and your burglar alarm's going off. So like I have a plan on how to deal with that, which still I got totally adrenalized and then didn't fall back asleep until 5 a.m. But it's to your point, like you have to actually invest some thought energy into that now rather than when somebody's clubbing you in the back of the head.
Yeah. I frequently say to people, I'd rather have you deal with it now in practice and training rather than at midnight on the corner of State and Main. Especially a life-threatening crisis, it's a come-as-you-are affair. You don't get a chance. Nobody says, hey, at midnight, I'm going to jump out from behind that dumpster and try and skin you alive.
Bingo.
So get ready. But the strangest thing about getting ready for it is that just visualization, not even specific visualization, but what we call generally adaptive visualization, right? Trying to picture yourself doing well, picture yourself having some kind of in an event that has some kind of tenure in your life, right? Just imagining yourself doing well actually has a measurable benefit in performance. It's funny.
Thoughts are things, right?
Absolutely. When the old Soviet Union was, dominating the Olympics, I mean, they had taken it on as a national enterprise, right? But when they were dominating the Olympics, they spent an incredible amount of time and energy doing visualization. Up to 30%, they thought of performance was visualization. And so what I like to say to people is, you don't have to be Karnak. You don't have to predict an event and get ready for it. I mean, our ability to predict the future is very limited, but you can look in the paper and find an event that has some intersection with your life. The little story in the paper, section B, page 3, right? Man robs dry cleaners. Well, I go to the dry cleaners every now and again. What happened? Oh, a guy walked into dry cleaners with a shotgun. Oh, okay. Well, if that happened to me, where would I be standing? Where would the guy come in the door? What would happen? What would my options be? Right? Just walking through that scenario, building a parking spot in your head, there's a measurable effect for that, right? Picture how much scores in pistol matches would go down if people weren't allowed to have a walkthrough.
Sure.
When they walk through, they're building a visual image and planning what they're going to do. Well, if you rob them of that opportunity, you change the scores quite a bit.
Sure.
So we get to not predict specifically, but predict and imagine, if we took the time to, generally adaptive responses, right? Things that might generally be helpful. And then work on things that are relevant. A fast, efficient presentation, right? Seeking cover, all those kinds of good things, right?
Sure,
and if we work on those in advance, a little preparation goes a long way. Yeah.
I think just to bolster your point for those listening or watching that maybe don't understand or appreciate the power of that, fighter pilots, I was introduced to the commander of the Blue Angels once, named Tom Frosher. He just retired from that position. And those guys sit and they with their eyes closed, practice every move, bank, turn, dip, roll of their aerobatics with the planes before they ever go out. Fighters do it. Every special operations soldier I've ever met has talked in great detail how they and their teammates would use visualization. I'm not telling this to you, but so people understand this isn't just like some like hippy dippy idea that fuels our subconscious. It doesn't know the difference between reality and what we tell it.
No, not at all. I mean, if you think about it, both reality and our thoughts are represented for us inside our head, right? We take in the signals from the world, but it's our brain that converts it into what we see. So there's no difference. I mean, the reason dreams seem so realistic is they're using the same perceptual system that the real world, unquote, does. And, stress, we use that term all the time, but stress is just the body's response to demands placed on it. And those demands can be internal or external. The body doesn't know the difference between game stress and real stress, unquote. And you'll see people, in force-on-force exercises and simulations, completely adrenalized. People think that they're going to have in their mindset that suspension of disbelief. Well, I know this isn't real. And then they get in the scenario. Running courses like every January, we run a very involved scenario-based course. Tom Givens, Craig Douglas, and I run it in Oklahoma. And people coming out of the scenarios, they're frankly overwhelmed with adrenaline. I mean, I can't tell you how many times the scenario will end, and you look at the participant, and their pupils are the size. And their pupils are the size of pinpoints. They're just completely adrenalized, and so there's no observational point of view. Well, it's just me. I know it's a game. I know this isn't real. It doesn't work that way. Simulated stress is still stress. If you look at high performers, especially in shootings, right? They tend to be high performers in shooting sports. I got to spend a couple of days with Jim Cirillo, the famous NYPD and federal law enforcement guy. And it just a priceless experience, just to pick his brain for 2 days. I mean, if you got a chance to sit with Wyatt Earp for 2 days, you'd take it.
Yeah, he was pretty much the modern equivalent of Wyatt Earp.
Except he killed a lot more people.
Yeah, you're right.
And Cirillo was an elite pistol competitor.
Yeah.
And so when you looked at his line of duty shootings, they were elite shooting performances because he had a history of elite shooting performances. And to him, and he was a hunter, and he stressed over and over again the benefits of hunting. He said, I don't care if you like being out in the woods and all that, but you need to feel the adrenaline of stalking and using a firearm, to lethal effect. He spoke at length about the value of hunting. He said that when they were building the stakeout squad, they wanted guys that were competitive shooters, but hunters too. They, guys who had experience of shooting when it was literally life and death. Yeah, sure, it's a deer, but it's still life and death. And he wanted people that were comfortable with those stakes. And it's not subtle that if you find somebody that has a high performance level in those areas, that when real life shooting happens, they're high performers. Sure,
that makes good sense. The talking about him, I remember one of his books. He talked about their shooting team beating FBI shooting. I think they won like every police match in the country, or beat out every other. It's probably the NRA's police pistol league is probably what he was shooting at that time. But yeah, those guys, some of the drills that he had those guys shooting at, like 50 meters shooting bullseyes, like I can't even see to hit that stuff, let alone, and they're doing it with wheel guns.
Yeah. I firmly believe that people who learned to shoot on revolvers will always be better shooters. I've actually kind of gone back to the future in that I bought my first double action only pistol in a long, long time, just for the dry fire. I've never fired, rounds through it, because for me it's a dry fire aid. Double action dry fire is harder.
I shoot a double single, and I agree with that. Yeah.
especially, polymer frame guns, single action, if you will, especially ones with good triggers, dry fire doesn't really have that much value because the triggers are so good now that it's not that hard to get off a good trigger press. But with a double action Beretta that I have now, a 92D, really good dry fire performance. You got to work for it. And so I'm finding that very helpful.
Did Paul talk you into that?
No, and he laughed and laughed when I told him I was fine, because I find the resurgence of interest in Berettas really interesting. I think it's all that leftover lethal weapon love that we all have from way back when. But Paul Sharp is a long time pizza pistol guy, and so when I finally bought a 92D, he laughed and laughed. Went over to the dark side of the force. But it's funny talking about competition and the value of competition for just for adrenalized performance experience, stress inoculation. I know that term gets used a lot, but Mas Ayub is a huge believer in that too.
Yeah,
he competes regularly
for 40 years
and competes regularly no matter what the discipline is. I was visiting him down in Florida once, and he was off to take part in an IMSA match, the metallic silhouette, long-range metallic shooters. And I just sort of wrinkled my brow and said, Mas, you shoot IMSA? And he said, that's the only thing I could find this weekend. So for him, he said, that's the only thing I could find this weekend. Exactly right. But the point was the competition, not what it was. Just to go test his mettle. Exactly. And long range pistol shooting. What earthly tactical benefit should that have? Well, but the stress inoculation, that's the value. To put himself out there and risk embarrassing himself. I mean, think about it. When you're competing with guys who shoot at 100 meters or more with a pistol, you're likely going to get crushed. Yeah. But so to expose himself to that was the point. I think there's a lot to be learned in that. I dig it. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. Still working out of Colorado. He was one of the IPSC greats back in the 80s. I can't think of his name. He called competition bloodless combat. That's Absolutely. Like how he always phrased it. I can't think of his name. Now it's making me feel like a ding dong. It'll come to me. It'll occur to you in the middle of the night or in the shower. It will. That's excuse me, I'm fighting off a cold. That's all right. That's something I think a lot of people, I tell students a story. So I do some public speaking from time to time, and it's not, I'm over it now, but there's been times where standing in front of like a class like you or I would teach where there's 20 people would cause me a great amount of unease and anxiety. And I had to get up in front of 400 or 500 people once, this wasn't that long ago, 5-6 years ago. And that's really when I broke it. It wasn't an overnight thing, but I remember all I had to do was talk for about a minute. It wasn't even some like big to do. I had to introduce a friend of mine at this event. And so my buddy was like, hey, a couple minutes, your turn, blah, blah, blah. And I said, whatever, I'm cool. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh man, my throat's real dry. And I realized that my heart was doing like $160. So I'm like, shit, I am like full blown anxiety. So I ditch out to the bathroom, and some of our listeners have heard me tell this story before. And I'm looking at myself in the mirror, I'm splashing a little water on my face, and I know what's happening to myself. And I look at myself and I literally tell myself aloud in the mirror, you can just get in your truck and leave. You can text one of them. It's not like I'm not doing anything important. I'm just introducing somebody. You can leave. Tell them you got sick and you had to go home. Make some bullshit up and leave. And I looked at myself and was like, you coward. Like, you're not doing anything like terrible. But I, at that moment, made the decision. If I give into this, I'll always give into it. At some point you got to say enough's enough. But I tell students that was it wasn't fighting somebody. Nobody was stabbing or choking me, but I was in full blown fight or flight. My body took the stress and said, like, figure it out, do something, like run away. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Well, actually, there's an important step to think. When you're thinking about the process, don't forget the mediation that's happening internally, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the event that there's a crowd and all that. It's our imagining of what's going to happen. Right on. you're sitting there and there's 400 people or 500 people sitting there, and in your mind, this, many thoughts will bubble up. But one that might bubble right to the surface is, I'm going to make a fool of myself.
Sure.
I'm going to embarrass myself. And then the following on thoughts from that, everyone will laugh, everyone will point, the worst case scenarios come to mind so easily. And what we're panicking about is those. And so we're panicking about the internal representation of something that has not even happened.
Right.
But it's real. When you're experiencing it, it's absolutely real. Inside your head is where the interface with the world takes place. But it also, when we interface with our own thoughts, our own imagined outcomes, they're in the same place that the real world inhabits in our brains, and so their experience is real. And I often say panic is the right feeling at the wrong time. Right? If you open the door and there's a lion on your porch, well, you're going to panic. But if you don't open the door because you think there will be a lion on the porch, that's panic. It's the right feeling, but at the wrong time. There isn't a lion, but you're acting as if there were.
Writing that down.
Yeah, so it's the right feeling at the wrong time. It happens all the time. I had a fascinating experience with it. I was taking a medication once. I had a series of eye problems a long, long time ago, and they were fishing around trying to figure out what it was. And one of the medications they administered caused a cortisol response.
Oh, wow.
So your body, my body in that case, starts to panic. I took the medication at night, took the first dose, and I'm sitting there watching the news, and all of a sudden I became aware of like this little feeling of sweat trickling down the side of my head. And
it sounds horrible.
Aware of my heart pounding and this funny feeling of dread. But I got lucky in that I immediately associated it with the medication. So I knew it wasn't me panicking. I knew it was my body panicking. And to sit there and watch panic from that one step of remove, I know I'm not panicking. I know was fascinating.
That's cool.
It was like watching a drone, be flown by someone else. So I've actually seen panic, but luckily enough, I got the message early on that it was resulted of the medication. But I often thought, what would have happened if I hadn't made that connection right away? Well, you can think that, well, I have all this ambient anxiety. I'm having this terrible feeling. It must be because of something. And so we start looking for a coat hook to hang the bad feelings on. And if I hadn't been able to find the real one, I would have found whatever came to hand. And this is how kind of phobias can get built in.
Sure. I can't go on the highway or this happens. I can't go up on something. Yeah.
I can't be alone or this happens, right? We're looking for a coat hook to hang these sensations on. But that's also the promise of self-intervention. Because if you can say to yourself, it isn't me, it's my body, right? Then suddenly all the steam is out of it. It's just a series of things that are happening. And I often tell people that managing stress is really convincing yourself that you don't have to like it, you just have to do it. So that's patience. That's people that think about shooting and taking part in shooting competition. Yeah, you might be embarrassed. You might go out there and really look not so good. But there's a benefit to that. It isn't all downside. Even the worst case scenario has a benefit. But it's hard to get people over the hurdle of what they imagine will happen and what they imagine they'll feel about it when it does.
We use the phrase exposure equals composure, which expose yourself to that over and over. As long as you're not developing a negative response, you can expose yourself to something that scares the shit out of you over and over, but not develop a positive response to it, which is, go ahead.
Even though we don't want people to ingrain a negative response, right? To do something and it goes badly, and you do it again and it goes badly, and you do it again and it goes badly. Well, it sounds a little weird to say the answer is to keep doing it, but that is the answer. Because eventually, just the law of large numbers will bear out that you can't have the worst case scenario every time, right? Sure. That at some point you're going to have something that's going to go less badly. And that's what you hope to learn from. Oh, wait a minute. On try number 12, it was a little bit better. Now, what did I do to make it a little bit better? People use so many kinds of analogies, but you've got to get back on the horse. That really is true.
Sure.
I think that was Mass's point, that you compete no matter what it's competing in, just to keep that part of you fresh. Because otherwise you can build what we call anticipatory dread, right? It's going to be so bad that I'll avoid it. And that can really, develop, I hate this expression, but that's where training scars, unquote, come from, right?
Sure.
That there's a negative outcome, and I worry so much about having that negative outcome again that I develop anticipatory dread. When a situation comes up that looks like it might be like the one where I looked so bad, I'll stay away from it. Mm-hmm. And that anticipatory dread can generalize to the point where, well, I don't want to take part in a shooting competition because I'll be embarrassed. Well, then that can spread to, I don't want to shoot in front of other people because I might be embarrassed. And that can spread to, well, I don't want to shoot because I might be embarrassed. And so you can see how it can generalize, can spread from even a few negative outcomes when, it's a little tricky to look somebody in the face and say, yeah, that horrible experience, I need you to repeat it. That's
in a lot of ways we're talking about self-image, right? How and this is my non-scientific interpretation, how like a lot of times we take people in this situation, take away their power to affect any change in themselves. It's not me that's having this anxiety. The anxiety is coming because of this outside influence. Thus, I just won't do it anymore. So they don't believe that they have any control to affect or change it. Would you find that accurate?
Absolutely. For the fancy pants version of that, we often talk about the distinction between an internal and an external perceived locus of control. And what we mean by that is, where do you see the power to make change? Is it inside you or outside you? Basically, Are you doing things or are things being done to you? Right? And
sure.
people with an internal perceived locus of control, they feel like they can make change. They feel like they can make things happen. And if you talk to high performers in real life-threatening circumstances, it generally comes down to a moment of decision, that it's not kind of a Rambo moment or a Braveheart moment, that it's a very quiet kind of decision. You'll hear, I talked with a police officer that was shot in the back of the head in an ambush and survived to kill his attacker. And he talked about lying on the floor of a little mini mart. He said, I decided I wasn't going out like that. That's it. Nothing dramatic. I decided I wasn't going out like that. A high school friend of mine who's since passed away, he was a fighter jet pilot for the Air Force, and he talked about a catastrophic series of failures he had on a night flight over the Mediterranean. Okay. And he talks about, kind of a worst case scenario, falling through the air and basically a dead plane. And he said, I couldn't see any of the instruments, so I had to get my flashlight working, and then I dropped it. And he said, but I love this notion of him, hurtling to the ground, kind of maximum acceleration. And he says, once I found the flashlight, everything was okay. Well, no, everything's not okay. But in his mind, once he found the flashlight, he could look at the instruments, which means he had information to start making decisions. And once he started making decisions,
what he had to do,
he could improve his circumstances in some way. Yeah. Now that's a perfect definition of internal perceived locus of control. And picture the opposite. I'm just now reminded of the fact that he actually died of cancer, very sadly. And that's something where you have zero control, right? You can do whatever you want, but if cancer is going to have its way with you, then it is. And so he had described this horrible life-threatening circumstance where he saved himself because of his internal perceived locus of control, and then was faced with a circumstance where that wasn't available to him.
Sure.
So
but you hear that same. Go ahead.
No, but how you see the world matters, and that perception, of your locus of control. Where do you cite it? Do you cite that locus of control inside or outside of you? And it matters quite a bit, especially in survival scenarios, because it does often come down to, am I going to be the kind of guy that dies here next to my car, or not? Right? And that's incredibly important.
I think one thing I've watched over the last couple years in the explosion, I'm a firearms advocate. I'm run an organization here in Illinois that helped change laws on a state level. And it's amazing to watch. As 20 years ago, there wasn't all of this training that exists. Like, I remember finding Bob Housingay the next state over and filling out a paper form that he mailed to me and mailing it back to him. Now you can go on the computer and find 500 people within an hour's drive that'll teach you something to do with a gun. And there's many great people teaching great stuff. I'm not one of those folks that wants to try to elevate myself or my friends that are in the business and pretend that there's not plenty of great people out there. But I do think so many people don't talk about what you're talking about, probably because they can't articulate some of it, but also it's too hippy dippy. I like to say hippy dippy. Like, they want to say, no, this fixes it. This fixes it. Not understanding that what you're talking about, this, which is the true essence of a mindset. Many people talk about mindset and they think about like you said, Braveheart, like it's got to be some dude with a battle hammer. But in reality, it's the simple idea that I can control or affect the outcome around me. Like, it begins with that before you pick the battle hammer up or sword or whatever. Right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's a two-edged sword, right? There's more interest in self-protection, and that's great. But there's also been this follow-on of people who are not comfortable being students, right? They want to be teachers. They want to be the guy at the front of the room with all the answers, whether they have the background to justify that or not. And so you find people that are barely more qualified than their students, hanging up a shingle.
Sure.
And it's tough. It's because this isn't a profession; it's a trade, right? I mean, you can hang up a sign and do it. There's no professional training that you have to go through. So the barrier to get into the business is very low, which is good. But the barrier to get into the business is really low, which is bad.
Sure.
But yeah, I think also somewhere along the line. Part of it happens on the mental health side of the fence. We haven't done a very good job in the business of mental health at translating what we know about people, which is quite a bit, to usable information. It doesn't seem actionable. It seems like something eggheads do in a building somewhere. And what's the point? But it does matter. And making that translational leap is something that's been a real interest to me. Because what I found is that people will, if they really delve into the field and in depth, they'll come up with something and they'll say, oh, I've often thought this. And they're surprised to hear that there's tons of academic research about that very specific thing. Really? I had no idea. And it's sad that we're kind of living in that silo mode of being where we don't know that there's somebody right next door spending a whole bunch of time trying to figure out exactly the same thing, but from a slightly different point of view. And there's a lot to learn on both sides from both directions. I don't think that's a stretch at all.
The course that you're most well known for in the circles that I run in is Unthinkable, correct?
Yeah. It's a full day course. Where about half of it is devoted to victim selection. All right, well, we know about how bad guys choose, and most importantly, don't choose victims, who they're going to aggress against. Then it's about another half day about the psychosocial development of violent criminal offenders. All right, how do you take somebody basically from the cradle to being a hazard to other people on the street? And we'll go through quite a bit of theories that have been tried out and found not to be good explanatory models, and towards some that I think are good explanatory models. Go ahead.
Is there one that you're saying is not a good predatory model that people may know, something that's been talked about or proliferated in the training world?
Oh yeah.
So what's a model people would understand or may have heard before that you're suggesting is no longer a best practice?
Well, I wouldn't call it a model, so to speak, as an approach, and it's what I call the fallacy of randomness. People think that street crime, especially, is random, Nothing could be further from the truth. Victims are chosen, and most specifically, non-victims are chosen as well. Now, it's that process that doesn't seem to make much sense to us, and so it's easy to say, well, it must just be random, except it's not.
Sure.
There's tons of research to show that bad guys are making decisions too, and they're making well thought out decisions, even if they can't articulate the way in which they're thought out. Very few bad guys are what we call good historians, right? They're not able to tell their own stories well. But they're not, street crime is not random. Violent crime is not random. And I think that leads people in, this is going to sound like a bit of a convoluted explanation, but if it's truly random, then there's no sense in trying to prepare for it, which makes me feel better for not preparing for it.
Sure. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen.
Nothing I can do about it.
If I'm going to get cancer, it's going to happen.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
It is amazing that, you take away cigarette smoking, lung cancer plummets, and yet people seem to, work it around in their head so that they're unrelated. Mm-hmm. Right? And my favorite example is I always use the same one. Look at Yul Brynner. He lived to be 80. Or look at my grandma. She lived to be 100 and smoking. Okay, for every one of those, there's somebody dying much, much earlier than they should have, right?
There's hundreds dying much sooner than they should have.
Yeah. People use this term all the time without really thinking about what it means. And this is the danger of kind of limited penetration of psychological concepts into the culture. And it's this term cognitive dissonance, all right? People act in ways that reduce their dissonance, all right? What I mean by that is if you have a belief and a behavior and they don't line up, right? Like let's say, the classic example was the actor River Phoenix. Do you remember that guy?
Sure.
He was a very young, young and very talented actor. Died of a multi-drug overdose while being a vegan. The joke at the time was, when River Phoenix was, rushed to the hospital dying of a drug overdose, they found everything in his bloodstream except red meat. When a guy who doesn't eat meat for health reasons has, 5, 6 psychoactive drugs in his system and dies from them, that's a perfect example of cognitive dissonance, right? He's got a pedophile priest. Oh, yeah. Who still thinks of himself as shepherding these youngsters to spiritual well-being. If you've got a belief, right, and your behavior doesn't match it, the funny thing is we don't change our behavior. We change our beliefs. That's the foundation of cognitive dissonance. We act to reduce that tension, that gap, the discrepancy between the two causes tension, and we don't like it. It's kind of like if you're running late to a meeting, you'll find a way to relieve the tension by saying something like, "Well, half that meeting's late anyway," and suddenly the pressure's off you, right? If you had the other thought, oh my God, this meeting starts on time, everybody's always there, your tension stays high and maybe even goes higher. So we're acting to reduce this dissonance from when our beliefs and our behavior don't line up. Well, if you think about it, thinking, I told you it was a long, convoluted explanation.
It's okay, I'm listening.
But if you think about criminal violence as random, hey man, it's like getting hit by a meteor. If it's your day, it's your day, Well, then you don't have to prepare for it. And if you think you don't have to prepare for it, then the cognitive dissonance caused by not preparing for it is relieved. So what's the point in training? There's no sense because I can't prepare for this thing anyway. There's no predicting it, right? So there's actually a really good explanation for why people are so firmly attached to something that's so clearly not true about street crime being random, and why they resist the notion that it is a purpose-driven activity. So it starts on the inside and goes out.
What would you say to, I get this a lot, we've got a YouTube channel that gets pretty good traffic, and once a month or so somebody will comment something to the effect of, way to go, asshole, making a bunch of people super paranoid about shit that probably will never happen to them.
Yeah, I get it all the time. You're just fear-mongering. Well, like I said, the panic is the right feeling at the wrong time. Well, paranoia is the right feeling taken too far, right? Being concerned about something, right? Even preparing for something doesn't mean I'm losing sleep over it.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a fine line where it's interesting, like the different cliques of people. Like the ShivWorks collective has like a clique of people that are around them, not in a negative way. Tom Givens, he's got a whole group of people. Moss has a whole group of people, that kind of like they gravitate towards the teaching style, towards the maybe it's age and demographics and such. And there's a bunch of young, high-speed ninja, Green Beret, Navy SEAL types that some of them are good friends of mine. If they have a lot of these younger dudes that don't know who guys like Moss are or you are, or God forbid, they definitely don't know who Jim Cirillo is or gents like that. But some of them, I run into them. These guys are, it's not just training to them. It is religion. It's their pastime. It's their social time. It's their entertainment, where it becomes like all encompassing, which is neither good or bad, but it just goes far beyond like the idea or the thought process of I'm going to get good with a firearm and learn how to identify a threat and keep myself alive. It goes way beyond that for some people.
It's a competition between kind of false icons. I think of it, right? I mean, shooting is fun.
Yeah, for sure.
I hate to say that, it's so funny because there are people who say, I'm not here to have fun. I'm here to train. Well, I think of those as both really, really good things to do.
Sure.
That you can have that are training and that are very explicitly, that training should drive practice, right? That what you learn in training should be applied to your practice. But also, there's going to be times when you're just out there for fun. It is entertainment, right? And to the extent that your fun has a practice value, well, great. The person who plays a lot of tennis, right? They benefit from that exercise, but they're not out there to work out, not necessarily, right? They're doing both at the same time. And so we don't have to worship one or the other, right? I think a nice, well-rounded life should have a lot of all of those things. I agree. That if you make friends in the shooting sports and in the training community, that's not a bad thing. That's an added benefit. But the notion that there shouldn't have any fun, that if we're training, it should be deadly, deadly serious and all that sort of thing, that's a little ridiculous too. I mean, the notion that I'm going to do something that's unpleasant and I'm going to make it unpleasant and I'm going to force myself to do it, that's a bad model to try and set up a behavior that you hope will be repeated. Right? It's not going to be repeated if it's unpleasant.
I train with thumbtacks inside my shoes.
Outstanding. Right? I put broken glass all over the grips. All right, so it's suffer.
Exactly. It's interesting though. Like there's many guys I know that are coming back from war, and you don't know shit. You've never stormed a hill. All right, like that's your viewpoint, or that stuff that guy was teaching. That's from 1950. That guy doesn't know shit, and it's sometimes we're missing the point, which is to stay alive so you can enjoy your life, not just to be a badass and shoot holes in things.
Well, the element that I think is most important is context, right?
Amen.
What I want to know is, when somebody comes back from a career of, storming hills and kicking doors and chasing bad guys and shooting them in the face, that's great. Of those skills, what translates in the context that he's teaching? When will the, civilian, stockbroker or soccer mom, perfectly caricatured soccer mom, when will she ever be kitted up with a long gun and a team full of guys storming up a hill? So every context doesn't translate. And I have no problem with people teaching all sorts of stuff. But I think it's got to be dosed in context. What's the likely need for carbine skills for the average person? Not that great. But what about concealed carry skills? The odds go way up of that being something that's actually needed. Mm-hmm. Carrying in a way that doesn't get you arrested, right?
Kind of important.
A smooth, efficient presentation, all right? Not shooting people, all right? That's a very valuable skill, all right? Not shooting people if you don't have to, not shooting the wrong people under any circumstances. There's no acceptable margin of loss. There's no acceptable casualties in a civilian context, right? Mm-hmm. There is in a lot of other contexts, right? So context matters quite a bit. But at the same time, the flip side of that argument is also true. It is a challenge sometimes to get people to look at their training as anything other than fun. Getting people to make that switch that when you square up on the line and, you get a command to shoot, that you should be simulating a fight to the best of your ability. Right. It isn't just fun. It isn't just learning a psychomotor skill like piano lessons, right? That the whole point is to get the full value, and the full value comes from creating an artificial emotional reality so that you can get that experience of drawing and moving and shooting against a real live threat. And it's hard. That's work.
Sure.
Because, it is work to get your mind to the point that it isn't just a matter with the fellows having fun. That's valuable too, but there's a time and a place for all of it.
Kind of go back a step here. One of the guys that I do work with, veteran Green Beret that did many, many years as such, deployed many times. He helps us teach some of our programs. He's got a speech that he gives, and he's talking about guys making light of their stress. So you're on the line at a class setting or a competition, and there's the guy that is adrenalized. So then they try to make it like it's no big deal. Ha ha, I'm just out here. It's a training class. Who cares? And he said, I just listened to him give the speech this past weekend. He talks about there's nothing wrong with that stress, as you described. It's your body's natural reaction to what you're telling it is stressful. And what he wants people to do in that is, rather than make light of it or make it all about fun, is to start to go through processes such as, this is my body ramping me up to do dirty deeds, or to step up on stage and speak coherently and not lose my shit and mumble and forget what I'm saying. So it seems like many people, and this is something that I find a lot, I screwed up on the line, or I screwed up in this iteration, so it's just a joke. It's not, we're just out here having fun, and they don't take it to that level where they appreciate that stress that they're under in the training environment. And part of it's like, for the way I interpret it, is ego. I don't want to admit to you that I'm adrenalized right now and that it's causing me to be uncomfortable. So I'm going to make dumb jokes and not really take this seriously, because a real man wouldn't admit that he's juiced up over just standing out here with his buddies. Yeah, what do you think about any of that?
It's the kind of myth of stress, or referred to as arousal. But whenever you say arousal, people
go on.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't mean that or arousal. But
are you wearing pants right now, William?
We'll never know. But the arousal, stress, unquote, increases performance until it doesn't. Stress is a little bit like water. Water's a good thing until right about here. About here, water stops being a good thing and starts being a bad thing. You can get performance improvement just by raising people's stress. Claude Werner, the tactical professor, when he was the head instructor at the Rogers Shooting School, he said he could get 10 to 20% performance improvement just by standing next to people going, come on, just putting pressure on them to do better. 10 to 20%.
That's awesome.
Performance improvement. I know. Well, but the myth, or the fallacy rather, of stress is that less stress is always better. Well, that's not true. I mean, if you and I had zero stress right now, we'd both be asleep.
Right.
Might be a lot more interesting if we were both kind of like, but
Just an hour of that.
That's right. It takes a certain amount of arousal, to wake up, to get out of bed, to have this conversation. It's going well. You get excited. Your arousal, your stress level goes up.
You don't need to keep clarifying that. We know you're not talking about sex.
Yeah. But we're always talking about sex. It's like the old joke, everything's about sex except sex, which is about power. But the notion that if you're feeling stressed, you should do something to lower it. Like you'll see people, on the line of, oh, I need to calm down. No, you don't. You need to harness that arousal to perform at a higher level than you would.
That's what Z's talking about.
It's exactly right. I mean, the notion that you could wake somebody up out of a deep sleep, and then hit the beeper and they'd perform better because they're under zero stress. It's absurd, right? When you talk about getting jocked up, to a certain extent, you're talking about feeling stress, recognizing it as stress, harnessing the power of that stress, right? And using it to perform better. It isn't always better to reduce stress. We think of stress as somehow a bad thing. It's not. It's not a bad thing in and of itself. Think about a stress continuum, sort of, an artificial 0 to 10. Well, from 0 to 4, you're deeply, deeply relaxed, which could be really bad if you're flying a plane or getting ready to defend your life, right? 5, 6, 7, you're optimally stressed all the way up to the point where you're sort of getting overly stressed, right? If you think about it, if you're at work and you had a time-sensitive task, the boss comes in and says, hey, this is really important. I need it in 2 hours. You look at the task, you realize 2 hours is enough time to do what you need to get done. Say, okay, great. Let's say 35 minutes later, he comes in and says, I was wrong. We only have 1 hour. So in other words, you only have 25 minutes left. Well, now my stress level has gone way up. And let's say he keeps coming back every 5 minutes going, listen, the big boss just pulled into the parking lot. We got to do this thing. We got to do this thing. Now the stress isn't motivating. It's actually clouding your ability to do it because you're up 7, 8, 9. You can't take in new information. You can't function. You tend to get lost in panic, right? And then at 10, 10 out of 10 stress, you're just not functional. You're so overwhelmed that you can't do the task. You just can't function. So it's getting our arousal into that zone that works, but doesn't work us, if that makes any sense, right?
Yeah.
If you look at, you can tell where people sort of stress thermometer is set by what they do when they have to do a task. Especially in the modern age, it makes parents crazy because there are kids who, when they set out to do their homework, they lay out their books and their notebooks, and then they turn on the radio and the phone and the television, and they've got all. We're like, no, turn all that stuff off and concentrate. Well, but all they're trying to do is get into a level of arousal that works. Sure. Just like there are some people who need everything quiet. When they're trying to concentrate, they need to lower stimulation, lower their arousal. I find this fascinating in cars. When people get lost in their car, they turn the radio off.
I got to pay attention. Yeah, quit talking to me. Sure.
But what you're doing is lowering the level of stimulation, lowering the level of stress, getting too high, so I need to lower it into a level where it works for me, but doesn't work me, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
So we're always trying to manage stress, but the notion that we should always be reducing it is nuts. It's just a fallacy. Sometimes you need to harness it and use it instead.
Which, back to what you talked about earlier, having that cortisol reaction in your body, Z's point is understanding this is physiology happening. It's not you being fearful or you having some adverse reaction to your friends watching. It's physiology. Now, let it ruin you, or I'm just being redundant here, but I'm putting it in dumb people terms. Or work with it.
It's exactly right. But also that's something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable right off the bat, is that you are not your body.
Yeah.
That your body can be having a reaction that's got nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
Right? That you are not your body.
I suffered from chronic anxiety and panic attacks for 15 years of my life, from mid-teens into probably early 30s. By 30, I had pretty well licked it. Once I started understanding some of these concepts that we're talking about, I never went on any medication. I only talked to one doctor about it once, partially because of ego, but it was embarrassing. I'm a man. I don't have anxiety. I don't want to talk about that, but crippling panic attacks that came from what I thought was all kinds of outside influences, until finally I really started to understand. You're talking about cortisol. I've studied that. I could probably talk about cortisol in the body like a doctor, but okay, like I smoke cigarettes. Geez, I wonder if all the nicotine in my bloodstream, had anything to do with accelerating any of that. Or I'm going to drink 6 beers to fall asleep. I wonder if that caused a negative effect in my body. So like some of it was understanding ingesting certain things wasn't helping or fixing the problem and was exasperating it. But then like how I thought about the anxiety or fear or worry, and then how I reacted to it. Like, I got to get out of here. I don't got to get out of here. Walking out of this room doesn't change anything unless it's 180 degrees and that's the problem, or there's some allergen in here. But it took me a long time to figure that stuff out. Maybe a doctor or somebody like yourself could have slapped some sense into me.
But, a lot of the times we don't do a particularly good job, meaning we in the mental health business don't do a particularly good job of making it make sense to people, right? Mm-hmm. Some of it seems awfully abstract. Like to say, well, hey, one of the most important things you're going to do to manage your panic disorder is to really grasp, and I don't mean kind of intellectually understand, I mean really grasp that you and your body are not the same thing.
Yeah.
And that if we can get to the point where you're one step removed, observing what's happening to the body, you've already robbed it of some of its power.
Exactly.
Right? The number one complaint of people that show up in the emergency room with what later turns out to be panic attack is they think you're having a heart attack.
Yeah.
They think they're literally dying. And nobody does that for fun. Nobody becomes convinced that they're dying for giggles, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they really, really believe it. But heart attacks can't be made to go away by giving somebody 5 milligrams of Valium, and panic attacks can.
Sure.
And so recognizing that it's a real sensation, it's really happening, but it's really happening to the body, and you and the body are not the same thing.
Sure.
That global, the most important global symptom for panic attack is this feeling of dread. Just that something terrible is happening. I'm about to die, right? Can't really attribute it to anything. It's just there, right? And thinking of that, one of the first steps of getting better is convincing yourself that that's a feeling that I'm having. It's not something about me. It's a feeling that I'm having. And the example I always use is a fever. You say, I have a fever. You don't say, I am a fever, right? Fever is something that you have. It's an abnormal state in the body, right? Mm-hmm. And just thinking of that helps. But thinking of that about ways of thinking and ways of feeling is harder than it is about physical sensations.
Full circle, we come back to the same point that all of this is illustrated. It's how we're thinking, what we're thinking, how we're reacting to. And like for myself, my true problem wasn't cigarettes or alcohol. It was a culmination of 20 years of how I grew up and how I thought in relationship to things that happened in and around my life. But like I've got a family member that I said it a moment ago, she driving on the freeway, she developed anxiety and she now thinks it's because of the freeway. She will not drive on a 4-lane freeway. Right. And I tell her,
because it seems to reduce the anxiety.
Yeah, if I don't do that, it doesn't happen. It's like all that shit's still there. That's still there. You're not making it go away.
That's that we call those masking symptoms, right? It's not the problem. It's actually just another symptom of the problem. But thinking about taking control of our thoughts and feelings, that's an unusual thing for most people. We think of thoughts and feelings as kind of like weather. They come and they go, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can complain about it, but you can't control it. When in reality, you can quite a bit.
Sure.
but it does take effort. All right.
Not new concepts. Guys like Marcus Aurelius wrote about that eons ago.
But getting people to buy it is hard. But again, that goes back doing the full circle thing, but that goes back to the internal or external perceived locus of control.
Do you think I'm sorry, please finish.
No, go ahead. You had a good question. I could tell.
Do you think if we went in a time machine 500, 1,000 years ago, that the average man walking around would have, I'm sure that they had anxiety, panic attacks, things like that? Were people showing up to the town medicine man, the tribal medicine man, thinking, my pump is going to explode, or have the stresses in our world and the things that we piled onto ourselves and the lights, the sounds, all of the crazy amount of stimulus around us, does it expanded that?
Well, I think we're more, it's funny because we're safer than we've ever been in a lot of ways, but we're less comfortable than we've ever been in a lot of ways. There's clearly less existential threat, right? We're safer and better, just medically, everything in terms of our well-being than we've ever been. Right? I mean, think about life expectancy now. When you're born, you got 8 decades on the house. That is so long compared to what used to happen. I mean, think about mortality in childbirth. I mean, it used to be a substantial percentage of babies and mothers dying in childbirth, right? And now that's shocking. I mean, it would almost make the news, if somebody died in childbirth, right?
Right.
But so that's taken off the table, right? The notion that you're going to be, leave your office here and get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, that is not a concern you ever have to have. That threat has been removed from your world. But now we have other things that fill in the gap, right? Like, am I going to have enough money to pay my property tax bill, right? Things like that. But also the way our bodies are designed and our minds have come to follow is we ramp up and ramp down. We're good at charge and discharge. Think about it. Our ancestors, would face life-threatening crises all the time, right? I need to get some food today or some of these kids are going to die, right? That's real stress. I'm not trying to catch a prehistoric rabbit or something, right? And delicious. So I feel that's right. I feel that stress and it ramps up, and then I discharge it and it ramps down. Even the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems do the same thing. Ramp up and then ramp down, ramp up and ramp down. But we experience much more chronic stress where we ramp up and stay there. Ramp up and stay there and stay there. And there isn't as much discharge. We don't ever get to deliver that payload of stress. And so people are under more chronic stress, and we're not really good, either physically or mentally, at managing chronic stress. We're good at acute, which we then discharge by resolving the circumstance one way or another. But if you're under stress all day, and then you go to bed and wake up, and tomorrow you're under stress all day, and you wake up tomorrow and you're under stress all day, that's bad for us. We're really set up a little bit like a seesaw. There should be a balance of ups and downs, charge and discharge, charge and discharge. And if you think about it, you fell into, given the history that you told, one of the traps, which, cigarettes are an amazing trap for people with anxiety. Sure. Because if I said to you, I need a few minutes to get all jacked up, let me go smoke a cigarette. That's not what people say. They say, I need a few minutes to relax. I need a few minutes to calm
for a minute. Yeah.
Let me go smoke a cigarette. But you're ingesting a stimulant, right? Anything ending in "ene" is a stimulant, right? Nicotine, caffeine, cocaine, right?
Right.
And so loading up on stimulants all day long, wondering why I'm anxious.
Sure.
People do it all the time, and the thing that they think is relax to get into their workable stress zone is actually putting them above the edges of their workable stress zone. And so chronic stress, no, we don't handle that well at all. And chronic stress is worse than it's ever been. So even though our existential threat matrix is much, much more manageable than it used to be, the odds of any of us getting killed in any given day are pretty doggone low.
So you don't think that Industrial Revolution, Dad having to go pound coal all day or lay track, putting the railroad down, that for all things considered, they weren't worried perhaps about a large property tax bill, but they're worried about Timmy getting cholera or typhus or whatever the thing was. You don't think that it was a commensurate amount of stress loaded onto them? I mean, like at this day and age, you don't pay your property taxes. What's the worst that happens? They take your house and you go live with a family member. Right.
But, they had two things that we didn't have. One is they knew they couldn't control, that they couldn't control, frankly, that they could control almost nothing. Right? We didn't understand the germ theory of illness, right? It just seemed like God would point at you and Shazam, you were sick and died. Mm-hmm. Now things more under our control, which now means we have to control them. You see people get stressed out all the time. Did the baby bottle I used, did it have BPA in it? And that gave my kid this terrible disease. So it's my fault. Since we have more power, we take on more stress. But the other is the dad you're talking about who's digging coal or pounding railroad spikes all day gets to discharge some of that stress, right? When he's literally swinging physical exertion. Yeah. When he's swinging that hammer, he's thinking about crushing the boss's head. At least some of the time, I'll bet you anything. Mm-hmm. Do that. If you're in a job where you sit at a computer and do this, you don't get to exert yourself and discharge that stress physically. Yeah. Which is why I think, the people that, there's no question that people that work out are healthier. Sure. Not just physically, but they're healthier mentally because they're discharging some of that stress, Yeah. But that's a tough sell. I've had a hard day, you want me to go work out? I don't know about that. I want to go relax. Yeah, but you got to think of it as discharging a certain amount of stress. And if we don't get to, it just builds up. During the long phase before, sort of the global war on terror started, there were a lot of guys who would get out of the military because they were what they used to refer to as getting spun up. They were forever training and getting ready, but they never really got to do anything in their minds. And so they'd get spun up. They'd get ready to do something and ready and called off every single time. And it got so frustrating, a lot of them got out. Now we've got the flip side of that, right? We've been at war for 17 years. The operational tempo is its own kind of stress. But you're absolutely right in that it's a balance between kinds of stress. And every kind of stress is going to have costs and benefits. Right?
Go ahead, please.
Well, there are some benefits to experience of existential threat. If you read, I think it's Sebastian Junger's book Tribe, you talk a lot of guys, that spend a lot of time deployed. They identify them as some of the most meaningful experiences of their life. Miserable, scared, getting shot at, but doing all those things together. Mm-hmm. And that feeling of together is what made it so meaningful. And they come back to regular life, working at Costco, and it just doesn't have that.
They don't have that bond.
Yeah, even though in a lot of ways things are way better. I'm not in a foxhole, right? I'm not getting shot at. I'm not getting, dysentery. But why doesn't it feel good? Why don't I feel this tremendous sense of relief? Because I also lost something, right? And that's hard to process. That coming back to normal life, unquote, the good life, can be a kind of loss, but it turns out that it is. Mm-hmm. And it comes from the transition between those kinds of stress.
Interesting. That's interesting. We've covered a massive amount of ground from your Unthinkable program. And I don't want to circle back because I think all of this stuff is super meaningful. That the kind of the basis of this podcast is that we're not just talking about what's the best bullet to shoot bad guys with or what's the best gun, 92D apparently. But
yeah, you sure we can't devote an hour to 9 versus 45? Because that would be really a lot of fun.
I was about to just hit escape. No, if I had a nickel for every comment that I've been sent or see where somebody explains the simple idea of I don't need any of that. I just need to do the Mozambique drill with my 1911 loaded with Hydra shocks. It's like, all right, you got it, brother. You know what you're doing. I was going to comment yesterday. I had a conversation with a friend of mine. His name's Scott Puckett. Scott now runs training for Sorinex. Sorinex is a well-known company that provides exercise equipment and gym equipment. Now they're doing tactical training. Scott's super. I didn't know. Yeah, they built a beautiful facility called The Farm in not far from where they're at in Lexington, down in South Carolina there. And he had a lengthy career in law enforcement and in overseas contracting. Great dude, super fit though. And he's kind of like, he's not your typical Southerner. He's very keyed up, very loud. This is how he talks. He's kind of like doesn't look like, but he acts like just a keyed up, charged up guy. He's a ball of energy. And so we were talking about processes. Like I have a process at the end of the day. I don't chug a pot of coffee because I value sleep, because I know if I don't sleep, I'm not going to feel good the next day. And when I wake up, I eat certain things and I do certain things to like get my busted joints working correctly. And so the nature of the discussion was, what are those processes? And they can't, like, what works for me might not work for you or somebody else, but kind of the conclusion that we came to, or the overall idea that we were discussing, is so many people, I think, are just unaware of the need to have simple processes in their life. I'm all keyed up from this job I hate that I'm driving to in traffic, smoking cigs, and I get home and eat a shitty meal and drink a bunch of booze and crash, and I don't know why I feel shitty. So kind of the overall theme was like this desire of wellness. You've got to start taking like a broader look and then develop some of these processes. And I think a lot of people don't like that because it sounds like work. Like, well, you're just telling me I got to do more work, man.
Yeah, it does. Like, if you were to say to somebody, I want you to, tell me which one of these is more relaxing, holding on to this heavy thing or putting it down. Right, well, putting it down is clearly more relaxing, right? That's what I'd do if I'd relax. But if you think of it as a necessary act of discharge, right? It's a necessary act of using up some of this, I hate this term because it sounds so woo-woo, but using up some of the negative energy that builds up during the day, that negative stress, that unwanted, unhelpful stress.
Why does that sound woo-woo?
Negative energy makes it sound like something you could store in a crystal.
Oh, I got you.
That's.
Wait a minute. What? You can't store energy in crystals?
No, you store energy in chakras.
I wish I would have just pulled like a big crystal out on a necklace.
Right. One of those big, nasty quartz.
I have a sibling that hands those to people when they're sick. Here, just hold these.
Yeah, if you take it and smash it into your head really hard.
Sit on it.
If you could get people to look at it differently, that it's the sort of preventative maintenance.
Yeah.
But also doing it repetitively enough that it becomes a habit. Habit is incredibly powerful. Both good habits and bad habits are incredibly powerful because, they have a function we call automaticity. Those annoyingly fit people, right? They're up at 5 a.m. jogging, they're not even awake. I swear, they're not even awake until, they're a couple of blocks down the street and they go, oh, okay, I'm jogging. And that's the power of automaticity. It just sort of happens. And you'll hear more and more people talk about it. Jocko Willink, of course, talks about it. People don't need motivation; they need discipline. Certainly true. At the same time, discipline comes from repetition. So to get people to do it many times, you got to get them to do it once.
Yeah. That was the gist of our conversation. Where does that desire come from? Like, you can't go to a doctor and get desire,
but you've got to do it once before you can do it many times.
Sure.
Once you've done it many times, it becomes a habit. You exercise the habit long enough, it just becomes who you are. And there isn't a question of do I do it or not. It's that question makes as much sense as do I breathe or not. I'm just doing it. I don't have to decide.
Mm-hmm.
Once habits are in place, they have that power, but getting them there is the hard part. There can't be a second one until there's a first one. And there has to be some benefit. I have to see some benefit from doing the first one, or I won't do the second one. And then there's no chance of it becoming a habit, no chance of it becoming something that I'm disciplined about. So
you still have a regular practice, general psychology practice?
Yeah. I stopped working at agencies. The VA did it. The VA killed my ability to work for agencies. That was the last. I remember leaving the VA on my last day and literally sitting in the parking lot under the building saying, I am never working for anybody else again as long as I live.
I see.
And so I just have a private practice now, seeing about 30% folks somehow related to substance use disorders or addictive disorders. The first 10 years of my career, I worked in addictions pretty much straight through. About 30% post-traumatic stress disorder, and the rest is just general mental health. Mood disorders, we call them age and stage problems, all that kind of good stuff. But then on the weekends, I'm teaching about between 30 and 40 weeks a year.
How many of those classes are near home? How many are on the road?
Virtually all of them on the road. Nobody's an expert in their own hometown. That's just the truth. It's really quite odd.
That's funny. I get messages from people that don't know me, and they're like, "Why are you never doing classes around town?" And it's like, well, that's based on what you just said. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. Part of me, I understand. My dad is a mostly retired physician now, and he did a lot of expert testimony back in the day. Fortunately, never in the state. And he explained to me.
It's a big deal when you fly somebody in, right? This guy must be important. He got flown in.
He explained it in a way that made perfect sense to me. He said, think about it. You got two doctors equally, well respected, but one's from Massachusetts. The other one, he's just the best one you could find around here. The natural approach is that you can't help it. The layperson thinks the person who came in from far away must be a big expert, must be better than all the guys they got locally. That's not necessarily true at all, but I understand why people would think it.
Now, to toot your horn for you, because you're probably not a horn tooter, you do have some people that cite your work, that have you teach on their behalf or to their students, like Moss. Moss touts your work, Craig's work, Craig Douglas, and others. So it's not like clearly the stuff you're passing on is accurate. Usually, I've got you on here, thus you're validated.
Clearly, yes. But, I always do. One day I'd get to the mountaintop, and here it is. But no, Mass was kind enough to invite me to write a chapter in his latest book. What the experts want you to know about self-protection, I think it's called. And that was really nice to write a chapter, because the very first class I ever took was from Mass. Look at that.
Chuck. She was sick of not getting any attention. Yeah, you were telling me about that when we chatted on the phone. That was him and Bob were a couple of my mentors.
Yeah. And Bob he's another one of those guys, Bob Housingay, that when you take a class with him, you wonder, why isn't this guy just a huge name nationally? Because he's got so much to teach, so much to convey. But to come full circle with Mass, that was really interesting. He taught the very first class I ever took was LFI 1, way back when. I think that was 1988. And so to hang around long enough to get to the point where he asked me to write a chapter in his book, that was really gratifying.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Kind of a long way around the book.
Yeah. There's not a lot of new things to invent in this field, in my opinion. It's just people are coming up with better ways to articulate things, better ways to pass on information in meaningful and thoughtful ways. Now you're taking your experiences, law enforcement, working with people that have come from various backgrounds, and helping average man understand how dangerous criminals think and operate. And that's huge. G.I. Joe said, go ahead.
Exactly. I wish I could remember who said it, but somebody said, if you want to learn something new, look in an old book. And it's true. It's easy to forget the foundations. It's easy to forget the foundations when you're relying on those foundations, because they just seem like givens, but they weren't always. They weren't always commonly accepted. They were fought tooth and nail by the truths that they replaced. And it's easy to see, that when you start off on the shoulders of giants, it's easy to forget that they had to build what you're standing on. And so I think, especially, folks newly getting into the game, their time would be very well spent looking back on some of the old guys, unquote. Reading Fast and Fancy Revolver Shooting.
Heck yeah.
By Ed McGregor.
Which is not a fun read. His style of writing was kind of hard to. Yeah.
It's a terrible book in a lot of ways, but it can still be read.
I've got no second place winners on the nightstand right now. I've been reading through it. I've probably read it 20 times over the years.
In Gravest Extreme by Mass, right? All these books are really important. Otherwise, you'll hear, especially folks that are new to the game, but are teaching, even though they're quite new to the game, talking about things as if they invented them, that really need some pretty extensive attribution. To my mind, attribution is the key. You can use anything you want as long as you recognize and admit freely where you got it. Otherwise, for students to think that you came up with it, and I think there are more instructors doing that unintentionally than there are, frankly, claiming things that they shouldn't be. But attribution is something that we all need to do, and a real model, I think, for everybody is Mass. I mean, Mass is the most anal retentive about attribution. I mean, if he got something somebody else, he says it every single time, and I think that's a real model for all of us.
A couple years ago, I had somebody contact me on Instagram. I had a video that was viewed a couple 100,000 times. Some simple pistol manipulation that I was explaining something about. And guy called me, found my number because it's posted, and called me up angry. And this guy is kind of somebody in the field, and he builds products that are used by a lot of other instructors. And he said, "You dumb son of a bitch, you are touting that this is your stuff." Not at all. Not whatsoever. I've never, anybody that knows me knows I very easily will tell you that I didn't come up with anything. I'm just reciting and putting things in my words. I go, "What are you talking about?" And so he explains it, and he goes, "That came from so-and-so." And I started laughing, and he's like, "Why are you laughing?" I said, "Dude, the guy that you're talking about wasn't even born when dudes were doing this. Like, Bob taught me this manipulation, and Bob didn't say it came from him. It was like the way that one would manipulate a pistol with one hand was what it was all about, having to work the slide, reload it." And so this guy was saying, like, his friend 5 years ago came up with this one-handed pistol manipulation. And I'm like, "Yeah, like you like no context to what you're talking about right there. You had no context or no breadth of knowledge." Every couple months, I'll take a stack of books off my bookshelf and I'll lay them out on the floor, and I'll take a nice photo of it and I'll put it up on our Instagram account and on our Facebook account, and I'll write the titles because it's hard to see in a little picture on your phone screen. And some of them are newer books, but a lot of them are older books. And guys will be like, who the hell's Jim Cirillo or Al Jordan or any of these people? And think, well, that's why I'm posting it. Like, go take a look, because bullets still fly the same, and humans are still made of the same meat and blood. And it's mind-numbing at times how much has already been figured out, but people are trying to come up with these new ideas and topics, and it's nothing really to sort out.
Yeah, it's really, it's a dangerous trend. I mean, as every business, and this is a business, as every business expands, it's easy to become ahistorical, right? You can just lose the thread that led the field to be where it is, because the emphasis is always on the new thing, the newest, latest, freshest. Well, a lot of times the newest, latest, freshest is just somebody rediscovering something that somebody else came up with a century ago or half a century ago. And I think that separates, or somebody who's really taken an interest in it as a profession versus somebody who's just riding a wave. Is that depth of knowledge. We want to be, in a perfect world, we'd be a mile wide and a mile deep. But there's a real pressure, to try and cover more and more stuff. And the worst outcome is that you're a mile wide and an inch deep, So I think that's something we could all think about, is go back and look at the roots, and that's what professions do. Professions that have a body of knowledge that you have to demonstrate mastery of before you can get a license, let's say. They teach history and systems. Where did this come from? What was the developmental path that this like Farnham calls it, the art, right? What's the developmental path that art followed? And it didn't spring from somebody's forehead 5 years ago, I can tell you that.
John will be up at our range pretty soon. They've got him hosting him up here for a couple-day class. It's interesting. The one thing I tell students at the end of every class is, I've got a list of guys, and I say, go find these people if you can, because I might be by you or you might be up here, and I'll say, here's some dudes that I know travel around. If you see their name, like one of the ShivWorks guys or Mass or some of these other people, hook up with them and go invest your energy. I get students, I'm sure you see it too, like I was talking about the clickiness, like I only can go train with Tom and Lynn Givens, which should not be a bad thing to do, but go experience more. So I'll have people that'll come 4 or 5 times, and it's like, look, I want to take your money, but I don't have anything else to give you, man. I'm not holding on to some secret, I don't have some little book in my back pocket with more junk I'm holding out to you. Pay me enough money, go see William or Paul or some of these other people, and you're going to get all kinds of crap because I go train with those people so I can learn new stuff.
You mean it's not like Scientology? If you pay more, you get more.
Right. Exactly. I need that model.
But whenever I see, folks that have taken, 20 classes with the same instructor, I often say, you can take all of somebody's repertoire and then spend the rest of that money looking at other people. And that's not being unfaithful. That's not cheating on that person. Taking a class that you look back on and go, wow, I really didn't get anything out of that. That in and of itself is valuable. To take a class and go, wow, okay, I wouldn't do what that person recommends, right? That is in and of itself valuable. I look at every class is, if I get one thing out of a class that I kind of add to my, toolbox, so to speak, add to my repertoire, then it was worth it.
Catchphrase.
A toolbox? I know, I hate it.
Super.
But if you get one concept or one practice or one thing that you change about whatever it is you do, you got your money's worth out of that class.
Yeah.
By far.
Yeah.
And so that's the goal. Is I think you should be, the bar should be pretty low to try something, but the bar should be pretty high to repeat. I'll take class with anybody, but I might not take a second, unless there was something really compelling.
Of course, as somebody's journey begins in anything, start college, everything's new and all the stuff you've not heard. But after 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of studying this small sector of human knowledge, it starts to become harder. I've got a good friend that's a nationally ranked grandmaster shooter, and he's trained with every big school you can think of from a fighting standpoint, as well as being a USPSA GM. And we'll go to courses together sometimes. And he's a far better shooter than I am, but we have these deep intellectual conversations, and we analyze the class or what we got out of it. And it's almost every time he's bummed. that we do these classes. And I tell them, what the hell do you think you're going to learn, man? Like, you're a better shooter than all the instructors are. You're the nationally ranked GM that shoots for a major pistol manufacturer. So they're not teaching you some little mechanical thing that you haven't already figured out. And you've attended like Rogers and Gunsight and all these different schools. Moss, he's done Gibbons, done them all. So you've gotten, and some of them multiple times. Like, what are you trying to get? Where from that, like at some point, like you're now the samurai, you're now the Jedi, whatever analogy you want to attach to it. And he teaches, but at some point there's diminishing. Like, I don't want to go spend $500, give up a weekend with my family and only get like one little thing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. It's got to be, there has to be some value in it, or what brings you back.
Yeah.
It can't just be an excess of money, or or just pure masochism. I mean, you've got to have something that you identify as a benefit.
Yeah.
One of the things that I like to do, I think is most important, is if you've taken a class and you still see the value. Like I went to Rogers, I go to Rogers every year, actually, just to sort of reset my odometer, because it's an objective test, right? You can see how am I doing this year as opposed to last year. But I took it left-handed last time I went.
Cool. Did you swap your holster to the other side?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I took the class as if I were left-handed, and that was really interesting. To go and sort of crash and burn, and just and find a way to make it work without changing back. It was really fascinating. So there's always
I saw a guy do that in a class once. How to sidetrack you a little bit? How was that experience? Would you go back and do it again? I don't mean like that specific thing, but would you try that again? Was it what you gleaned out of it worth the effort and expense of time and energy?
Yeah, I think, especially shooting mirror image, as if you were, the other-handed, it's the only way to get in touch with what beginners do once you're no longer a beginner. Because once you're no longer a beginner, you do so much stuff automatically that, so much good stuff, that you just don't realize that it's automatic, and that beginners don't have that automatic function. Well, you put the gun on your left hand, you find yourself doing all this dumb stuff that you would never, ever do. And suddenly you're acting just like a beginner.
I got to think about
way to
that.
really get back in touch with that beginner. The left-handed draw stroke, right? You find your right hand doing all kinds of weird stuff. Like, why is my right hand in front of the muzzle? I would never do that in a million years, drawing with my right hand. But it's the way to really get in touch with being a beginner, because just like a beginner, you don't have an explanation for why you're doing the stupid thing. You're just doing it.
Yeah.
And you would never do that, in your right mind, in your right hand.
I'm assuming you practiced before you went. You didn't just show up and slap a left-handed holster on and try to shoot.
No, I did. I took the basic.
Okay.
I've always taken intermediate and advanced, but I took the basic pistol course left-handed, and I didn't practice for it. I didn't spin up for it. I wanted to show up just like a beginner would.
Okay.
Yeah, it was freaky.
I like it.
It was really interesting. There's always ways to find more challenge, but it's more work to find more challenge when you're good.
Yeah.
Excuse me. When you have a lot of experience, it's harder to find, ways to push yourself. The late trainer Todd Lewis Green had a great line once. He said, when you always practice alone, you're always in first place. And so, his point was that getting out of your normal run-of-the-mill context is the only way to push yourself, and pushing yourself is the only way to get better.
Sure.
Right? Just I know people that go to the range and do the exact same thing every time. And they're
Plinking.
As much as people, talk badly at times about James Yeager, he made a very important distinction once. James said there's a difference between training and going shooting.
Yeah.
And I would argue there's the third thing. There's training, there's practice, and then there's going shooting.
Sure.
And they all have value, but you can't confuse them. Right?
Sure.
Going shooting is fun. Just going, plinking, right? Like, that word has kind of gotten lost, but I mean, that used to be fun. You go and shoot Coke cans in 22, right?
Yeah. Which is actually how many good shooters learn to shoot too.
Yeah. But it's just, it's not meant to be terribly serious. Now, if you think, oh yeah, I'm always training, what training did you do? Oh, I went out to the dump 2 weeks ago and shot Coke cans with my 22. Well, that's not training. That's plinking, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. But the only danger is when you confuse those three elements,
Yeah, you're not preparing yourself. And as you said, practice. Practice is now training. Usually you're learning something new. Then you go back and practice it, right?
Exactly.
Take it back to your home range.
So when people, I'll see people who'll go to a training course, and they'll think that what they're getting is practice. It's not. When hopefully in a training course, you're being exposed to something new.
Right.
It's then to go back and practice it. That's a whole different task. All right.
We could have a whole podcast just on how to be a good student. I talk about this sometimes in some videos that we've done. And that's a big man problem. Show up, look cool, do good in class. Whereas being totally open and mindful about our movements and thinking, and am I getting what Will just said? Am I holding the thing the way he told me to? Or am I just trying to go fast and do good? Right. I want to do good in class.
Also, I think you can really tell by watching students when they're given something new and then told to let's say practice it freestyle, meaning at their own pace.
Sure.
And you'll watch some students, let's say there's a free practice period of 10 minutes. You'll see some students will practice the technique 100 times in those 10 minutes. Some will do it twice and then start chatting because they're not really trying the technique out.
Right.
But they intend to keep their own technique, whatever it is, which they've just assumed is better than the new thing they just saw. But the only way you can find out if a new technique, a new practice, a new manipulation skill is better than yours is to do it a lot.
Right.
And especially right there under the eyes of the person who just showed it to you, so they can go, well, hold on a second, you're doing it wrong. Do it like this. And then do it a bunch of times while you're under that person's eye, and only then are you really qualified to say, no, I think I'll keep the first thing. I like it better.
Yeah, sometimes you got to shake your head when you see people like that, which is some of those folks are the ones that are there for entertainment, or it's my buddy's taking the class, so we're here together. Nothing wrong with that. That person's not going to excel.
Yeah, I call that infotainment.
Infotainment. Yeah, that's the same. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
They're getting information, and it is learning, unquote. But really, it's just meant to be pleasing, right? It's not. They're not going in there with the notion of that I'm sort of bringing on ideas, and I'm going to put those ideas into competition with my existing ideas and see which one comes out on top, right? Maybe my idea, the thing that I thought was the best way to reload, let's say, maybe that is best. But the only way to do it is have it compete with the new way, and then see which one comes out on top. Mm-hmm. That way, whatever idea comes out on top is the better idea, not just the one that you like better.
It's back to that main premise we were talking about with all of this is what's the person's goal? I don't know about you, but I talk about that a lot with folks in training. I ask myself that all the time, not just in training, but in my life. What is my goal? Do my actions align with the goal? Are they taking me to the goal, or am I just there to get infotainment or any whatever the excuse is, or whatever, not excuse, but whatever the reasoning is, am I applying action to get me there? And a lot of people are like, right. Well, I'm just here to get better. Well, what the hell does that mean? What's better? You could talk for hours on just that.
You know, what I often ask is, how would you know you got there?
Yeah.
You know,
what's that look like?
Yeah. How would you know that you got better? You know, and if it's just, well, I feel like I did, I don't know if that's accurate. I mean, how do you know you're just not giving yourself a bigger break?
Yeah.
You know, there's, you know, and so, you know, practice has to be objective. There has to be objective measures in the practice, or you can't compare one session to another, right?
For sure. That back to the, I probably am a little too introspective about some of these things because of challenges I faced myself. But if we can't look at things for what they are and then get our ego out of the way, why am I doing this? Well, guns are cool. They're badass. I feel like a tough guy. Nobody ever would articulate that. But if you really are doing it to truly be safer, why are you not listening to Will when he tells you to try it like this? Why did you just automatically take what you think is right and discard his stuff? Because you think you know better, because your ego's got you thinking that you're all Johnny Tough Guy because you got a holster strapped to your thigh with some super derpy gear on, all tacticooled out. Now I'm being a dick.
Yeah, it's a tough racket to stay. The word that keeps popping into mind is honest, but that's not the word. It's a tough racket to stay legitimate.
Legitimate, you know what I mean? As the shooter or as the instructor or student? Well, that's that honesty. It's self-honesty. Like, why am I doing this? You know, I have a saying, it's not my saying, but I say, know thyself. Know thyself, know thy shit. Don't show up with 6 different guns and train with 6 different guns unless you're a gun writer and you're trying to like experiment with these tools. You know, have a gun. Like Bianchi said, John Bianchi, 1 gun, 1 holster all the time, right? And I'm not getting preachy, but like if you're seriously trying to protect yourself, show up and have the approach to the, I say practice. You said John Farnham says art. Same thing. Like approach it with that attitude and be somewhat humble about it, and not, which requires like a level of self-honesty that I don't know everything. I am here to improve. My ego is going to get in the way a little bit because I'm a man and that's just the way it works, but I'll try to put it in check. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, you know, all I ask is that you admit that there's a bunch of different motivations for doing a lot of this stuff, and different motivations are the one that's operational at any given time. There have been courses I've taken just to see what somebody was like. What is that guy like? I never met him. I never, you know, I've read what he wrote. Or
you mean you were trying to get material to steal?
Hey, if I paid for the class, it's not stolen. You know, then there are some that I've, you know, I've heard this guy has an approach to this thing, and now I want to see it. But you know, then there are others that have taken just for fun. Yeah. And so, you know, we can have more than one reason to take a class. And that's okay, as long as we're honest about what they are.
I have taken classes just to go hang out with my friends and shoot.
I've taken classes because the people that I wanted to hang out with, the people that were in the class.
Yeah, just to get a bunch of time, but I look at it as practice. I'm not there to like try all of this guy's techniques. Maybe I will, but I'm going to get 1,000 rounds through the gun this weekend and not have to do anything but focus on me for a minute. I'm going to be selfish and think about me.
Yeah, well, it's the, you know, when you think about the equivalent of playing catch, right? When you're playing catch with a baseball or a football or whatever, you're not learning anything necessarily. You're exercising the skills you already have, but it's diverting. It's enjoyable, right? It's just engaging in a task that you enjoy. If you don't know how to throw a football and you go out, you're not playing catch. You're trying to learn how to throw a football, right?
Right on.
So sometimes you're just going to be playing catch. just shooting is fun and trying to shoot well is fun, but you might be there for some other reason altogether, and that's perfectly okay. But people have a tendency to really hunker down if you say something like, well, you're just really here to have fun. Oh, no way, dude. I'm here to train. This is all about saving my life. Okay. Well, I'm here to have fun.
Who's the last person that you trained with just to have fun? Or will it offend somebody if you say their name?
No, not at all. But I especially like conference settings. Because you can go sit in on somebody's class that you would never, might never travel to do a whole weekend class, but, for 2 hours or 4 hours to see what they're talking about. Fascinating.
Right on.
Right? Just to see, sort of, that's why I think conferences are so great, because you can sample people.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough call to say, I'm going to sign up for this class, travel somewhere for a weekend, lodging, everything like that, just to see how it is.
Right on.
That's a big ticket item.
I have traveled across the country before to do what you were just stating, like try something out. Like everybody talks about this guy, I want to check it out. And he was a fine person. The material was fine, but it was very dated. And he was really insulting to the people that were in the class. And he insulted other people that were friends of mine that he didn't know were friends of mine. I just thought, man, I just drove like 800 miles, which was fun. My son came with me and we had a road trip. But like, I talked to friends later. I'm like, why didn't any of you tell me? They're like, well, we know you. You would have said we're not going to take your opinion. So I was like, all right, well, next time you tell me, before I drive across the country.
Next time, give me a little bit of a warning.
Uh-huh. I was with Frank Proctor last year, 2 years ago. We had Frank up here. We hosted a course. I'm sure you know who Frank Proctor is.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the stuff that he passed on was so simple and elegant. Have you ever had a chance to train with him?
No, I haven't.
I have borrowed, and I tell every student where it came from. Some of his whole premise of pistol training is not just seeing the sights, but being hyper aware of everything that your eyes are taking in and seeing what you need to see when you need to see it. Very nothing new to a guy like you that shot guns for years and years, but he's come up with a lot of really cool drills that really hone in for the shooter on how to shoot things that are moving or while you're moving faster. And then you look at it, you're like, why didn't I think of that? And so like being in that class alone was like, wow, okay, I would have paid twice as much just to see and hear his take on that one thing. So I guess I now contradicted my earlier point.
No, not at all. There's like I said, there's bunches of reasons, and they can all be operational at the same time. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think the people are kind of falsely pure in their motivations, right? I mean, for a lot of people, they'll go to a class, let's say a competition class, and to them, it's not combative in any way. A pistol to them is just a tennis racket. It's the tool they use to play their sport. And I'm perfectly okay with that. The shooting sports are perfectly, a perfectly acceptable endeavor.
Sure.
To sit here and say, well, if you're not, carrying a gun to save your life, well, then why are you taking a shooting class? They're engaging in a sport that happens to be a shooting sport, and that's fine with me. I'd like it if they also took an interest in self-protection, but to sit here and get holier than thou about their motivations is kind of silly.
Mm-hmm. Sure. That's an interesting viewpoint there. We could go on into these different threads forever. I'm going to have you on again if you're willing to do it and just talk about your Unthinkable course, go into some of that stuff, what you're willing to share to people not paying. I think we'll have to do that again if you're.
I'd love to. I'll be up in the Chicago area in April of 2019, and so
what are the dates for that?
Yeah, April 6th. And so that'll be great if we can get together before then. That would be great.
Yeah, I believe you're the guy that's bringing you up here is a buddy of mine, and he, I believe, is bringing you to our place. Okay. Yeah. How do people get a hold of you?
I have a website called aprillriskconsulting.com. It's APRILL. That second L is pretty important. Riskconsulting.com. But I think a great way to kind of put your toes in the water is if you go to Instagram. I have an Instagram account, same name, Aprill Risk Consulting. I try to put up 5 to 7 little nuggets a week. Things from the news, things from kind of latest things that have happened, and some interpretation, and also some little background bits. And they're real short, and some video clips, some news stories, things like that. And it's a good way to get your toes in the water thinking about bad guys.
I just put a picture up of this and tagged you in it, so some people should be seeing you now. Yeah. Got a good couple hundred of them up now, so it's a good way to go through. Just because if you spend just a little segment of your day, make part of your daily. Yogis talk about, people that do a lot of yoga talk about their practice, their practice, and it means not only how they do their yoga, but it means kind of how they do their daily lives. And I think it's an interesting way for us to think about it too. Because when you have a practice, right, you have a way of being that involves self-protection, protection of other people that are important to you, getting your mind in that on a daily basis, I think is incredibly important. And not that it's the only way by far, but one way to do it is, take a look at that Instagram page, and just sort of, spend those couple of minutes every day thinking about stuff that's otherwise pretty unpleasant to think about. It's unfortunate, but true. I think we should wrap it there. Not for any reason other than we should save some for next time. We're an hour and 20 into it. So,
but I really appreciate you having me on. I really do.
I appreciate it, man. You're an icon, a legend.
That's right. That's correct.
That's right.
And if you don't believe me, just ask me.
Well, I tell you, I had the Sharp Boys here. We did a podcast at our office here. Paul and Dave are both buddies of mine, and it was fun. Like, it's interesting. Like, people in our community, you could be like a legend in our community, but nobody else in the whole wide world will know who you are. And I had 2 of them in my house at once, and then when they leave, we're joking. I'm like, then you're nobody again once you get on. I mean, of course I'm joking, but no, you're a highly respected dude in this field. So I appreciate your time. I know selfishly you're getting something out of it. You get to share with the world, and not selfishly in a negative way, but we're exposing you to people that's kind of one of my missions. I want to make sure that the good information's disseminated.
No, I appreciate it.
You're Jesus, and I'm just like Mark or Peter or one of those guys.
You said it, not me. But yeah, we'll have to do it again.
Nobody get upset about that. Yeah, for sure. We totally will.
Because that always works on the internet, is to tell the internet not to get upset about something.
Don't get upset. What I'm about to say, yeah. Don't send me, or this one, yeah. Don't send me stupid messages, and then you do the thing to get this.
Like there are all these people on the internet waiting to attack, but then they go, oh, wait, he told us not to get upset. Oh, okay. Thank goodness I don't have to get upset about that.
Yeah. William, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to double check the date for 6. I want to make sure I'm in town for that. I know I've got a few things going on that month. You got my number. Once we get this, we will send you a link so you can share it if you want to. And guys, check him out on Instagram. It's Aprill, 2 L's, Risk Consulting. Or is it just Aprill Risk?
No, Aprill Risk Consulting. That's a great place to start.
Whole word on Instagram, and then, of course, .com for the website, and they can get a hold of you, see class dates, locations, all that good stuff.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Very good, sir. Thank you much. Have a good day.
You too.
Visit our website, CarryTrainer.com, for information about classes held throughout the U.S., CarryTrainer apparel, and upcoming projects. You can also email us at training@CarryTrainer.com for information about setting up your own private course or speaking engagement. Training@CarryTrainer.com or CarryTrainer.com.